I never believed in ghosts or demons. As a seasoned paranormal investigator, I had encountered my fair share of eerie occurrences, but I always found a rational explanation. That was until I received a call about the Whitmore House, a seemingly ordinary two-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Locals whispered about the house being possessed by a demonic entity, with stories of real-life exorcisms and unsettling paranormal activity. Skeptical yet intrigued, I decided to take the case. The initial reports were disturbing. The family living there, the Martins, had experienced everything from objects moving on their own to blood-curdling screams in the dead of night. Father Andrew, a local priest, had attempted an exorcism but was forced to abandon it halfway due to the violent manifestations. Determined to uncover the truth, I packed my equipment and headed to the house. As I pulled up to the property, the house looked deceptively peaceful, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Mrs. Martin greeted me at the door, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. She led me inside, her hands trembling as she spoke about the horrors her family had endured. "The first sign was the smell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A foul sulfuric odor that permeated the house. Then came the voices, whispering things we couldn't understand, and the shadows, always moving in the corners of our eyes. I set up my equipment in the living room, the epicenter of the activity according to Mrs. Martin. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I began my initial investigation, recording temperatures, electromagnetic fields, and audio. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed watching me. Nightfall brought with it an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house. As I reviewed the initial recordings, I heard it. A low, guttural growl emanating from the audio recorder, unmistakably inhuman. My heart raced as I played it back, disbelief giving way to a cold, creeping fear. Around midnight, the activity escalated. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I reached for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, revealing nothing but the empty room. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft yet clear, calling my name from the shadows. I turned, and there, in the dim light, I saw it. A dark figure, indistinct but undeniably malevolent, lurking at the edge of the room. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of dread. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to stay the night. Little did I know, the horrors of the Whitmore house were just beginning to reveal themselves. I awoke the next morning, groggy and disoriented. The night had been a blur of whispers, cold spots, and shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing hour. Mrs. Martin was already up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. I nodded, recounting my experience with the shadowy figure. Her face paled, and she led me to the kitchen, where her husband and 2 children sat huddled together, their expressions mirroring her own. "We can't stay here," Mr. Martin said, his voice shaking. "Not after last night." He went on to describe how the entity had grown more aggressive, pushing and shoving them, whispering vile things in their ears. The youngest child, Sarah, had even seen the figure up close, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow as it loomed over her bed. As the family packed their belongings, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. A visit to the local library revealed a chilling past. The Whitmore house was built in the early 1900s by a man named Elias Whitmore, a reclusive figure rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals. His wife and 2 children had mysteriously vanished, and Elias was found dead in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols and an altar smeared with blood. Returning to the house, I ventured into the basement, the site of Elias Whitmore's death. The air grew colder with each step, and the sense of unease intensified. The basement was dark and damp with a heavy smell of mildew. In the far corner I found it, the remnants of the altar, the symbols still faintly visible on the floor. I set up my equipment, hoping to capture any evidence of the paranormal. As I began my EVP session, asking questions into the void, the air grew still. My breath caught in my throat as I reviewed the recording, hearing a faint but unmistakable voice. "Leave! Now!" it hissed, sending chills down my spine. Determined to confront whatever was haunting this place, I continued my investigation, unaware of the true terror that awaited me. Later that evening, as I reviewed the footage from the basement, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A shadowy figure standing behind me, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, the same eyes Sarah had described. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not dealing with a mere spirit, but something far more sinister. The Martin family left that night, seeking refuge with relatives. I stayed behind, determined to end this once and for all. Armed with the knowledge of Elias Whitmore's dark practices, I prepared for the confrontation, unaware that the true nature of the entity was beyond anything I had ever encountered. The third night in the Whitmore house was unlike any other. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I fortified myself with the tools of my trade: holy water, a crucifix, and a collection of ancient texts on demonology. Father Andrew had agreed to join me, bringing his own experience and faith to help cleanse the house. As the clock struck midnight, we gathered in the basement. Father Andrew began to pray, his voice steady but tense. The air grew heavier with each word, and the temperature plummeted. I felt a presence, a dark, oppressive force watching us from the shadows. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, a low growl echoed through the basement, followed by a chilling, disembodied laugh. Father Andrew continued his prayers, his voice unwavering despite the growing menace. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It moved with unnatural speed, rushing toward Father Andrew. I threw holy water in its path, and it recoiled, emitting a piercing shriek that reverberated through the basement. Undeterred, Father Andrew pressed on, his prayers growing louder and more fervent. The entity thrashed, its form shifting and writhing as if in agony. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, reacting to the power of the prayers. The oppressive atmosphere intensified, the air thick with a malevolent energy. Then, as suddenly as it began, the entity vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. We stood in the dark, our breaths heavy and labored. Father Andrew made the sign of the cross, his face pale but resolute. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This entity is powerful. It will take more than prayers to banish it." We decided to rest, knowing that the battle was far from finished. The events of the night had shaken me, but they had also steeled my resolve. I would not let this malevolent force claim another victim. The following day, I delved deeper into Elias Whitmore's past, uncovering more about his dark rituals. It became clear that he had summoned something beyond his control, a demon that now tormented the living. With this knowledge, I prepared for the final confrontation, determined to end the curse of the Whitmore house once and for all. The final night had arrived, and I was ready. Armed with everything I had learned about Elias Whitmore and his demonic practices, Father Andrew and I prepared for the ultimate showdown. We gathered every tool we could think of: blessed salt, holy water, crucifixes, and the most potent prayers from ancient texts. As the clock struck midnight, we began our ritual in the basement, the heart of the darkness. Father Andrew chanted prayers in Latin, and I sprinkled blessed salt in a protective circle around us. The air grew colder, the oppressive feeling of malevolence thickening with each passing moment. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and twist, taking on nightmarish forms. The entity was making its presence known, and it was not pleased. A deep guttural growl echoed through the basement, vibrating through the walls and into our bones. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing the shadowy figure with the sickly yellow eyes, now more tangible and more terrifying than ever. It rushed towards us, but this time we were prepared. I threw a vial of holy water directly at it, and it recoiled, shrieking in agony. Father Andrew's prayers grew louder and more commanding, filling the room with a powerful, almost tangible force. The symbols on the floor began to glow fiercely, reacting to the intensity of the prayers and the presence of the demon. The entity thrashed violently, its form becoming more distorted and unstable. It lashed out, sending objects flying across the room, but the protective circle held firm. With one final ear-piercing scream, the shadowy figure imploded, leaving behind a deafening silence. The room was still, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the shadows receded. Father Andrew and I stood in the basement, exhausted but victorious. The demon was gone, banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. The Whitmore house was finally at peace. The Martins could return to their home, free from the terror that had plagued them for so long. As I packed up my equipment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and accomplishment. This had been the most challenging and terrifying case of my career, but it was also the most rewarding. As I drove away from the Whitmore house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this experience had changed me. I had faced true evil and survived, but one thing was certain: I would never again doubt the existence of the supernatural or the power of faith in the face of darkness. The Whitmore house would forever be a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown, and the horrors that lurk just beyond our understanding.